The private jet sat quietly on the runway, engines cold, lights reflecting off its polished surface. It was the kind of aircraft that turned heads without trying, sleek, expensive, unmistakably exclusive. Around it, airport security stood alert, forming a tight perimeter. No press, no chaos, just authority. A man approached calmly from the side of the tarmac. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wore simple, dark clothing, no flashy logos, no visible urgency. To most people watching from a distance, he looked like someone important but not important enough to cause trouble. As he neared the jet, 2 guards stepped forward immediately. "Sir, you need to stop right there." The man paused. He listened. He didn't interrupt. "I'm scheduled to board," he said calmly, his voice low and even. One of the guards glanced at a clipboard. Another looked him up and down, clearly unimpressed. "This aircraft is restricted," the guard replied. "Only authorized personnel are allowed beyond this point." The man nodded once and reached into his jacket, producing documents, ownership papers, flight authorization. Everything was in order, at least it should have been. The guards barely looked. "This isn't sufficient," one of them said, handing the papers back. "You'll need to step away." Something shifted in the air. A few nearby crew members slowed their movements, sensing tension. A small group of airport staff had begun to notice. Whispers started. Eyes followed the exchange. The man remained still. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand respect. He didn't say who he was. Instead, he simply asked, "Can you call your supervisor?" The guard exhaled sharply, annoyed. "Sir, you're holding up operations." For the first time, the situation felt humiliating. Here was a man being blocked from a jet that clearly belonged to him, not by law, not by force, but by arrogance. And still, he refused to react the way most people would. No shouting, no threats, no ego, just silence. One of the guards turned away to speak into his radio. Another crossed his arms, confident, almost smug, as if this was already over. The crowd had grown now. People were watching openly. And standing there, calm and unmoved, was Seagal, though no one around him seemed to realize it yet. They thought they were dealing with an ordinary man. They were wrong. And what was about to happen next would change the tone of the entire runway. The delay stretched on longer than anyone expected. Security radios crackled softly. A supervisor was supposedly on the way. The jet remained sealed, untouched, as if frozen in time. For most people, this would have been the moment frustration took over. Raised voices, sharp gestures, threats of influence or power. But the man standing near the runway did none of that. He simply waited. Hands relaxed at his sides, shoulders steady, eyes calm, not wandering, not searching for approval. He didn't pace. He didn't check his watch. He didn't look back at the small crowd that had gathered behind the security line. That calmness was unsettling. One of the guards noticed it too. He shifted his stance, adjusting his posture, as if suddenly aware that something about this situation didn't feel normal anymore. This wasn't how confrontations usually went. People argued. People tried to prove something. This man didn't. A ground crew member whispered to another, quietly asking who the passenger was. No one had an answer. There was no entourage, no assistants running back and forth, no signs of urgency that usually followed high-profile individuals. And yet there was presence. The kind you can't explain, but you feel. The guard who had returned the documents earlier spoke again, this time more cautiously. "Sir, once the supervisor arrives, we'll sort this out." The man nodded. "That's fine." 2 simple words. No edge, no sarcasm. Minutes passed. The crowd grew slightly larger. A few phones were raised discreetly, though no one seemed quite sure why they were recording. Something told them this moment mattered. They just didn't know how yet. The man shifted his weight and glanced briefly at the jet. Not with frustration, but with familiarity. As if this was not a prize he was trying to win, but something that already belonged to him. Still, no name was spoken. No one realized they were looking at Seagal, a man known worldwide for discipline, control, and an almost unnerving composure under pressure. But here on the runway, none of that mattered. What mattered was how he carried himself now. There was no attempt to intimidate. No flexing of status. Just patience, the kind that makes authority uncomfortable. The kind that silently asks, "Are you sure you want to keep going?" The guards began to talk among themselves more quietly. Their earlier confidence softened into uncertainty. One of them avoided eye contact now. Another kept glancing toward the approaching service vehicle, waiting for backup, not because of danger, but because of doubt. And doubt is contagious. This situation, which had started as a routine denial, was slowly turning into something else entirely. Not louder, not more aggressive, just heavier, like the air before a storm. Because what most people don't understand is this: true authority doesn't rush, it doesn't explain itself, and it never panics. As the sound of an approaching vehicle finally echoed across the runway, the guards straightened up. Something was about to change. They just didn't know yet whether it would change in their favor. Before we continue, ask yourself this. If you were in his place, would you shout to prove your power, or stay calm and let the truth surface? The black airport SUV rolled slowly across the tarmac, its tires humming against the concrete. Conversations softened. Radios went quiet. The guards standing at the perimeter adjusted their posture as the vehicle approached. The supervisor had arrived. He stepped out with the kind of confidence that comes from routine authority, someone used to resolving minor disruptions quickly. He carried a tablet in one hand and a folder tucked under his arm. To him, this was likely just another passenger misunderstanding security protocol. He walked toward the man calmly waiting near the jet. "Sir," the supervisor began, polite but firm, "I'm told there's some confusion regarding access to this aircraft." The man nodded once. "No confusion. I'm scheduled to board." His voice was steady, measured, controlled. The supervisor extended his hand for the documents. This time, he actually reviewed them. His eyes scanned each page carefully, registration numbers, tail identification, authorization codes. Everything appeared legitimate. Yet something still didn't add up. He looked at the jet, then back at the man. "There seems to be a discrepancy in the ownership file on our system." A discrepancy. That word lingered in the air. Behind them, the small crowd of airport personnel had grown. Baggage handlers paused mid-task. A catering truck idled nearby. Even a pilot standing at a distance watched with quiet curiosity. The supervisor tapped at his tablet, frowning slightly. "According to our database, the primary registered contact is listed under a corporate holding group." The man didn't react. "That's correct," he said calmly. The supervisor looked up. "But your name doesn't appear directly in the immediate access log." There it was, bureaucracy colliding with reality. The guards, sensing validation, straightened slightly. Their earlier doubt faded just enough to restore a bit of their confidence. "Sir, until we receive direct confirmation from the registered authority, we cannot grant boarding clearance." It was official now. Access denied. The jet remained silent behind them, stairs lowered, door closed, engines waiting. A symbol of control temporarily out of reach. Most people in this position would feel cornered, embarrassed, angry. But the man's expression did not change. He glanced briefly at the supervisor's tablet. "Then perhaps your system needs updating." Not aggressive, not mocking, just factual. The supervisor exhaled slowly. "We'll need to verify with headquarters." He stepped aside and made a call, lowering his voice. The conversation was hushed but tense. Words like registration, liability, and clearance protocol floated faintly through the air. Minutes ticked by. The jet's scheduled departure time approached. That detail began to matter. A flight delay would trigger additional paperwork, penalties, coordination with air traffic control. What had started as a small procedural pause was now becoming operationally expensive. The supervisor ended the call, his expression unreadable. "We're escalating this for confirmation," he said. "Until then, I'm afraid the aircraft remains secured." The man nodded again, still calm. But now something subtle had shifted, not in him, but in the energy around him. The guards weren't relaxed anymore. They weren't smug, they were cautious. Because escalation cuts both ways. Another call was made. This time the supervisor walked farther away, speaking more urgently. His tone sharpened. He turned partially toward the jet as if comparing details being relayed over the phone. Behind the security line, someone whispered, "Who is he?" No one answered. The man finally reached into his pocket, not for documents this time, but for his phone. He didn't dial immediately. He simply looked at the screen for a moment. The symbolism was quiet but powerful. He had options. And he hadn't used them yet. The supervisor returned, jaw tight. "Sir, headquarters is reviewing the corporate ownership structure. It may take several more minutes." Several more minutes. The jet's crew inside the cabin had begun checking their watches. A pilot leaned slightly out of the doorway before stepping back inside. Time was applying pressure. The man finally lifted his phone. He dialed one number, no rush, no dramatic gesture. The line connected quickly. "Yes," he said calmly. "There seems to be a delay." He listened. There was no visible emotion in his face, no frustration, just quiet certainty. He ended the call in under 20 seconds. The supervisor's radio crackled almost immediately afterward. Static. Then a voice sharper than before. "Confirm tail number." The supervisor turned toward the jet and read it aloud. Silence followed, longer than comfortable. Every guard on the tarmac felt it. The weight of that silence. The kind that signals something important is unfolding behind the scenes. Then the radio spoke again. "Stand by." The supervisor swallowed subtly, because whatever was happening on the other end of line was no longer routine. The crowd sensed it too. Phones were no longer subtle. People were openly watching now. And for the first time since this confrontation began, the guards were no longer certain they were in control of it. The jet, once protected from an unauthorized passenger, now felt like a locked door with the wrong key holders standing in front of it. The supervisor's radio crackled again. This time, the voice carried urgency. "Sir, we need you to reconfirm the passenger's full name." The supervisor looked at the man standing calmly before him. "For documentation purposes," he said carefully. "May I have your name again?" The man met his eyes, no anger, no ego, no raised voice. He spoke clearly, and in that moment, everything began to change. The moment stretched longer than it should have. The supervisor stood waiting, tablet in hand, radio pressed lightly against his shoulder. Around him, the guards had gone still, not rigid, not relaxed, but uncertain. The kind of uncertainty that creeps in when authority senses it may have misjudged the situation. The man didn't rush to answer. He didn't correct anyone. He didn't repeat himself. He didn't remind them of anything they should already know. He simply spoke. "My name is Steven Seagal." No emphasis, no expectation of recognition, just a fact. For a brief second, nothing happened. The supervisor typed the name into his tablet. One of the guards glanced sideways at another, clearly trying to read his reaction. If anyone recognized the name, they didn't show it yet. "Thank you, sir," the supervisor said neutrally, as if this were still just procedure, but his fingers slowed as he typed. The radio on his shoulder crackled again. "Run that again," the voice said. "Confirm spelling." The supervisor repeated it. Silence followed. Not the casual kind, the heavy kind. The kind that makes professionals uncomfortable. The man, Steven Seagal, remained exactly where he was, phone resting loosely in his hand. He hadn't moved closer to the jet. He hadn't stepped back. His posture hadn't changed at all. That was the most unsettling part. The supervisor cleared his throat. "Sir, just to clarify, are you associated with the ownership group listed here?"
"Yes."
One word. No explanation. Another guard shifted his weight. He looked toward the jet, then back at Seagal, as if seeing him differently for the first time, not as a delayed passenger, but as an unknown variable. The radio crackled again, louder this time. "Hold all movement." The supervisor straightened. That wasn't normal. Airport operations were built on efficiency. Movement was constant. Delays were minimized. Hold all movement meant something higher up the chain had noticed. The supervisor took a step aside, lowering his voice as he spoke into the radio. "We're holding, but I need clarity on the directive." The response came quickly. "Do not escalate. Do not engage further. Stand by." The words landed like a quiet alarm. The guards exchanged looks. Their earlier confidence, the easy certainty that comes with uniforms and procedure, was gone now. In its place was caution, awareness, the realization that this situation had grown beyond their control. The man watched calmly. He hadn't made demands. He hadn't threatened consequences. He hadn't said, "Do you know who I am?" He didn't need to. The supervisor glanced at him again, this time with a different expression, not suspicion, but calculation. "Sir," he said carefully, "we're receiving confirmation from a higher level. It may take a few moments." "That's fine," Seagal replied. 2 more words, calm, unchanging. Another call came through on the supervisor's radio, this one quieter, almost hesitant. "As the passenger present at the aircraft?" "Yes," the supervisor answered, "the standing right in front of me." A pause. Then, "Do not delay further communication. Patch me through." The supervisor pressed a button on the radio and held it closer. The voice on the other end was different now, slower, controlled, unmistakably senior. "Sir," the voice said, addressing the supervisor but clearly aware of who was nearby. "The registration and access discrepancy has been resolved." The supervisor's jaw tightened. "Understood," he said. "Please advise next steps." Another pause. "Grant access immediately." The words were clear, final. The supervisor looked at the guards. For a split second, no one moved. Then, almost all at once, their posture changed. Shoulders lowered, arms uncrossed. One guard stepped aside without being told. Another reached for the barrier controls. The jet, which had felt like a symbol of denial just moments ago, now felt open, waiting. The supervisor turned back to Seagal. "I apologize for the delay." "Sir," he said, his tone noticeably different. "You're clear to proceed." Seagal nodded once. No smile, no satisfaction, no visible reaction at all. He took a single step forward, not hurried, not dramatic, just forward. As he walked toward the jet, the guards instinctively gave him space. No one spoke. No one stopped him. The crowd behind the security line watched in silence, suddenly aware they had just witnessed something they didn't fully understand. This hadn't been a confrontation. It had been a quiet correction. And as Seagal reached the base of the jet stairs, the message was unmistakable. True power doesn't announce itself. It waits and lets the world catch up. and the runway, once tense with resistance, now stood silent in respect. The shift was immediate. It wasn't announced, it wasn't dramatic, but everyone on the runway felt it. Moments earlier, the guards had stood firm, confident in procedure and protocol. Now, they stood aside not because they were told to move, but because they understood they should. The barrier was lowered quietly. No alarms, no commands shouted. Just a smooth, almost respectful clearing of the path. The supervisor took a half step back, creating space. Again, he said, carefully choosing his words, "I apologize for the inconvenience." The man acknowledged him with a slight nod and nothing more. No lectures, no correction, no visible satisfaction. That absence of reaction spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. As he moved toward the jet, the atmosphere transformed. The crowd that had gathered, ground staff, pilots, maintenance crews, fell silent. Phones were lowered. Whispers stopped. This was no longer entertainment. It was recognition. One of the guards, younger than the others, glanced toward his colleague and muttered under his breath, "That was him, right?" The other guard didn't answer immediately. His eyes followed the man walking toward the jet stairs, calm and unhurried. "Yeah," he finally said. That was him. For the first time, the name traveled quietly through the crowd. Steven Seagal, not spoken loudly, not announced, just understood. The jet crew inside the cabin had already received the update. The door opened smoothly. The stairs were fully extended. A flight attendant stood at attention, professional and composed, but clearly aware that something unusual had just occurred outside. As Seagal reached the base of the stairs, the supervisor moved again, not to block him, but to ensure nothing else stood in his way. "Everything is cleared," he said. "You're free to board at your convenience." At your convenience. That phrase hadn't existed 30 minutes earlier. Seagal paused briefly at the foot of the stairs and turned slightly, not toward the crowd but toward the guards who had first stopped him. There was no glare, no judgment, no resentment. Just a look. The kind that doesn't accuse, it reflects. One guard swallowed hard. Another straightened his posture instinctively, as if standing before someone of higher rank. Not because of fame, not because of fear, because of presence. Seagal gave a small nod, acknowledgement, not forgiveness, and began to ascend the stairs. Each step felt symbolic. Not of victory, but of correction. Behind him, the runway resumed movement slowly, cautiously. A baggage handler restarted his cart. A catering truck rolled forward. Radios clicked back to life, though voices remained subdued. The supervisor stood still for a moment longer than necessary, watching the jet. He replayed the encounter in his mind. There had been no shouting, no demands, no threats of lawsuits or influence. Just patience. And it unsettled him more than anger ever could. Because moments like this expose something most people misunderstand. Authority doesn't need to be proven in public. Real power doesn't compete. It waits. Inside the jet, Seagal took his seat without ceremony. No entourage followed. No instructions were barked. The cabin door closed smoothly behind him. Outside, the guards returned to their positions, but not the same positions they held before. Their posture was different now. So was their awareness. They had followed protocol perfectly. They had done their jobs correctly, and still they had been wrong. The engines began their low, steady hum. The supervisor finally turned away, already drafting the report in his head. He knew how it would read: temporary delay due to system discrepancy. Resolved. But that wouldn't capture what really happened. What really happened was this. A room full of authority figures learned that control doesn't always look like command. Sometimes, it looks like restraint. As the jet slowly taxied forward, sunlight glinting off its wings, the crowd dispersed, each person carrying a slightly altered understanding of power. And for the guards who had stood their ground at the beginning, one lesson remained unmistakably clear. The calmest person in the room is often the one you should pay the most attention to. Because when the realization finally arrives, it arrives all at once. When someone disrespects you, what shows more power: reacting loudly or staying silent and letting the truth surface? Comment below loud or silent. What happened on that runway wasn't just a security misunderstanding. It was a psychological demonstration. Long after the jet began taxiing, and the noise of the engines faded into the distance, one truth lingered in the minds of everyone who witnessed it. The most powerful person never raised his voice. Most people are taught that power is loud. That authority announces itself. That control looks like dominance, commands, and visible force. But psychology, real psychology, tells a very different story. Human beings instinctively react to emotional displays. Anger triggers resistance. Loudness invites challenge. The moment someone raises their voice, they subconsciously signal insecurity, a need to force recognition rather than receive it. That's why the calm response is so unsettling. On the runway, every guard had expected escalation. They were trained for it. Raised voices, entitlement, frustration. Those situations fit neatly into protocol. What they weren't prepared for was restraint. When Seagal remained calm, something critical happened beneath the surface. The power dynamic shifted. Silence creates a vacuum, and human minds rush to fill it. When no aggression is present, observers begin questioning their own certainty. Why isn't he angry? Why isn't he pushing back? What does he know that we don't? That internal questioning is where real authority begins. Psychologists call this asymmetric emotional control, when one party remains regulated while the other grows uncertain. The calmer individual appears dominant, not because they assert control, but because they don't need to. Notice what didn't happen on that runway. There was no, "Do you know who I am?" Threat of lawsuits, name dropping, display of influence. Those are tools of fragile power. Instead, there was patience, and patience signals options. When someone doesn't rush, doesn't argue, and doesn't defend themselves emotionally, the subconscious assumption is simply, they are not trapped. People who lack power need immediate outcomes. People who possess it can afford to wait. That waiting forces the other side to escalate, and escalation exposes mistakes. Every additional step the guards took made the situation heavier. Every extra call raised the stakes. Every delay increased the cost of being wrong. Meanwhile, Seagal did nothing, and that, nothing, applied pressure. This is why elite negotiators, military strategists, and high-level leaders are trained to control emotional output before anything else. Emotional neutrality deprives opponents of leverage. Anger gives your position away. Silence hides it. Another key element at play was predictability. People expect famous or powerful individuals to react emotionally. When they don't, it disrupts expectation patterns. That disruption creates hesitation, and hesitation creates space for truth to emerge. That's exactly what happened. The system was forced to correct itself, not because it was attacked, but because it was allowed to run until it revealed its own error. This is why silent power is feared more than loud power. Loud power can be measured. Silent power has no visible limits. It's also why the guards' behavior changed so dramatically after the realization. Respect didn't come from fear of consequences. It came from recognition of control. They hadn't encountered resistance. They had encountered certainty, and certainty doesn't argue. This lesson applies far beyond a runway. In workplaces, arguments escalate when egos clash. In public conflicts, voices rise because identities feel threatened. In personal disputes, people shout when they feel unheard. But the person who stays calm instantly occupies the psychological high ground. Not because they are superior, but because they are unshaken. That's the difference between dominance and authority. Dominance needs validation, authority assumes it. On that runway, authority didn't arrive with sirens or titles. It stood quietly and waited. And when the truth finally surfaced, it didn't need to be announced. Everyone felt it. That's the paradox of real power. The less it tries to prove itself, the more undeniable it becomes. And once you understand that, truly understand it, you realize why the calmest person in any tense situation is rarely the weakest. More often than not, they are the one holding all the cards. The jet began to move slowly, not abruptly, not triumphantly, just steadily, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The engines hummed with a low, controlled power, vibrating through the runway as the aircraft eased forward. The sound wasn't loud enough to dominate the space, but it was impossible to ignore. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. Every person standing there watched in silence. The guards remained still, hands folded in front of them, eyes tracking the jet as it rolled past. Their posture was different now. No longer defensive, no longer authoritative. It was observant, reflective. They weren't watching a celebrity leave. They were watching a lesson depart. The supervisor stood a few steps behind them, radio clipped to his shoulder, tablet forgotten at his side. The situation was technically resolved. The report would be filed. Procedures would be reviewed. Life would go on. But something had shifted. He replayed the moment again in his mind, the calm voice, the lack of resistance, the absence of ego. There had been no confrontation to win, yet somehow everything had changed. Inside the jet, Seagal sat quietly by the window. No phone calls, no commentary, no visible reaction. He looked out across the runway as it passed beneath him. Not with pride, not with relief, but with neutrality. The same neutrality he had carried from the moment he was stopped. That was the most powerful detail of all. The door had closed. The engines were lev. The situation was over. And yet he hadn't changed at all. As the jet reached the taxiway, sunlight reflected off its wings, briefly illuminating the faces of those still watching. A guard lowered his gaze. Another exhaled slowly, as if releasing tension he hadn't realized he was holding. One of them finally spoke quietly. He never even argued. No one replied. Because there was nothing to add. The jet turned and began its slow approach toward the runway threshold. Air traffic control cleared it for departure. The tower lights blinked. Everything was back on schedule. But for the people left behind, this wasn't just another departure. It was a reminder. A reminder that power doesn't always look the way we expect it to. That control isn't always loud. That authority doesn't need to announce itself. As the jet accelerated, engines rising in pitch, the sound filled the air, strong, controlled, inevitable. Within seconds, the aircraft lifted off the ground, wheels leaving the runway, climbing smoothly into the sky. Gone. The guards stood there a moment longer, watching until it disappeared into the distance. Then, slowly they returned to their posts. But not unchanged. Each of them would carry that moment forward, not as a mistake, but as an awareness, a quiet understanding that the calmest presence in a tense situation is often the one with the deepest foundation. The runway returned to its routine rhythm. Vehicles moved. Radios buzzed. Operations continued. Yet beneath the surface, something lingered. Because what happened that day wasn't about a jet. It wasn't about status. It wasn't about fame. It was about restraint. About knowing when not to speak. About letting systems reveal their own errors. About understanding that real confidence doesn't rush to be seen. In a world that rewards noise, reaction, and display, silence had commanded the most respect of all. And that is why this moment mattered. Not because someone was stopped. Not because someone was recognized. But because everyone watching learned the same lesson at the same time. Respect is not demanded, it is revealed. And sometimes, the most powerful exit is the quietest one.